The Lido in Paris is aflame with celebrities on the Champs-Élysées for the opening of a new and zesty show. Everybody who is anybody is there. The Duke of Windsor heads the notables, which include Michelle Morgan and the famous mustache of Salvador Dali and veteran Maurice Chevalier. The show itself scores an instant hit for the festive season, as well as the dancing which follows. Author François Sagan sets the pace for an occasion that is truly Parisian, truly festive, and in every sense, a success.
Science and technology policy, lacking a female diversity, not asking for a handout, just thinking about how to fix the drought. Your own science proves it, we bring the heat. Inclusion makes a brighter sector for us all, for our benefit. Let's bring the lights out and shine. Come on, equality begins with you and me. We're making new history equally, all in one sector. Look at what we can be.
Oh, well, hello there. Welcome back. I can smell the aroma of the cafeteria calling from here. Let's go say hello to the Science and Technology Policy lady. Well, hello and welcome. While lunch is in the oven, let's go over what we covered for episode 4.
Last episode, we covered Science and Technology Policy, Gender Parity, and Intersectionality, and discussed what intersectionality means with the help of our guest educator, Nemo.
Let's talk about intersectionality. Intersectionality focuses on how gender, class, race, age, ethnicity, ability, religion, social class, and sexuality cross-cut each other and intersect to create unique experiences of discrimination.
We also discussed how we need to apply an intersectional lens as well as a gender lens in order to fully address the issue of equality concerning the lack of women in science and technology policy, as well as the different approaches to help encourage equity within sectors that lead into science and technology policy before we reach equality. Episode 5, Science and Technology Policy Tests Positive for COVID, will cover how this sector has been affected by COVID and what can be done to help.
As with any systemic issue, when a global event happens, such as the COVID-19 pandemic, issues of equality are exacerbated.
The persistent underrepresentation and disempowerment of women in science has prompted policy interventions across national, regional, and international scientific communities. But a new report by the Australian Academy of Science has warned that important gains in gender equality may be lost as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. The Australian Academy of Science, with support from the Australian government, has produced this snapshot of the dynamic impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on women in the science, technology, engineering, and mathematics workforce throughout the Asia-Pacific region.
This report captures the lived experiences of women and highlights the important gains that have been made toward equality that could be erased if not addressed.
The main activities of this rapid research project were conducted between December 2020 and June 2021, with a focus on hearing the voices of women in the Asia-Pacific STEM workforce about their firsthand experiences. This mixed method and collaborative research project, including a survey of over 1,000 people in STEM, revealed the COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated pre-existing gender inequity in the STEM workforce across the Asia-Pacific region. This has been brought about by changes in lifestyle and the blurring of boundaries between the spheres of work and home, increased domestic and caring responsibilities, which have impeded work productivity, precarious and insecure work arrangements, and reduced access to research facilities and workplaces due to lockdown arrangements. These conditions have had significant impact on individual well-being as women in STEM respond to social change and balance cultural and familial expectations. People from different parts of the Asia-Pacific region share different perspectives of capacity in their economy to respond to these negative impacts. Regional collaboration, together with supportive workplaces and communities, can minimize gendered impacts of the pandemic on the STEM workforce now and in the post-pandemic recovery.
4 common themes emerged from the evidence.
These themes revealed an interwoven context that women in the STEM workforce were facing. These themes were impacts on professionals at work, challenged boundaries between work and non-work spheres, social change and individual well-being, and impacts in Asia-Pacific and beyond. The report concluded, while different contexts exist between economies, inequity in attracting, retaining, and progressing women in STEM career pathways is an ongoing characteristic in the STEM workforce throughout the region. The COVID-19 pandemic and its impacts are likely to deepen pre-existing gender imbalances. Structural inequalities and the intersection of multiple barriers faced by women in STEM have been highlighted in the pandemic. In the workplace, inequity in the full participation of individuals in STEM are rarely issues of gender alone, but rather involve a complex set of power relations in which knowledge, social class, socioeconomic status, and other elements are intertwined, which is why an intersectional lens is necessary. Providing supportive workplaces is crucial to minimize challenges facing women in the STEM workforce during the pandemic. These include flexible working arrangements, flexible measures of work productivity, and changing expectations of work value, such as raising the valuation of online teaching in academic performance when reviewing job promotion. These are some of the key findings in the report. While this report focuses on the Asia-Pacific region, as aforementioned, issues of inequality are rarely segregated, and more research needs to be conducted to understand how other regions are faring in comparison. The National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine concluded that this extends further than the Asia-Pacific and released a consensus study report, The Impact of COVID-19 on the Careers of Women in Academic Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. This report provides evidence at the end of 2020 that suggests the disruptions caused by the COVID-19 pandemic endangered the engagement, experience, and retention of women in academic STEM, and may roll back some of the achievement gains made by women in the academy to date.
That isn't the only concerning evidence.
This report concluded women in academia have suffered from increased workloads, decreased productivity, and other issues caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. Many women already faced problems of work-life balance, the report says. But preliminary data, including results from a survey of 900 U.S. women faculty, show that lack of access to childcare, in-home schooling, increased needs of elderly family members, and other physical and personal needs affected women more than men during the pandemic. In addition, many women in academia can't take advantage of increased online access to conferences and collaborations because of their caregiving duties. As a result, women in some disciplines reported decreased productivity. It wasn't universal, though. Publication rates among women in some scientific fields remained steady. The representation of women has slowly increased in STEM fields, but such progress is fragile and prone to setbacks, especially in times of crisis. Despite the growing appreciation of gender inequalities facing STEM communities, the development of effective interventions remains a subject of significant debate. To this end, the International Science Council is funding 2 projects which aim to increase gender equality in global science through improved sharing and use of evidence for effective policies and programs. The first of these projects, called the Gender Gap in Science, was led by the International Mathematical Union and the International Union of Pure and Applied Chemistry, with input from 9 other unions and organizations around the world. The project team performed a global survey of scientists, investigated the effect of gender in scientific publications, and compiled a database of best practices to support girls and women in STEM careers. The project report was published on the International Day for Women and Girls in Science and presented a range of recommendations for different stakeholders. The second project is a global survey on the inclusion and participation of women in scientific academies and unions. This survey was designed to gather statistics on gender equality and to determine the existence of policies and structures aimed at ensuring the full inclusion of women. The results of the survey and new recommendations based on the findings will be published later this year. The new report from the Australian Academy of Sciences provides valuable insight into the wide-reaching impacts of COVID-19 on existing inequalities and highlights the role that science systems can play in combating these effects. The task must be to work towards identifying processes and practices that banish inequitable gender roles and norms, address unequal power dynamics, and promote the status of women in science in ways that go beyond awareness in favor of effective, transformative action.
As we know, science and technology policy is comprised of 2 sectors, politics and STEM. We have covered the effects of COVID-19 on women in the STEM sector. Now let's take a look at the political sector.
Concerning women in politics and COVID-19, few analyses have probed the gendered consequences of these trends. In the media, the main narrative about gender and pandemic politics has centered on the perceived effectiveness of female politicians in responding to the crisis. Yet these positive headlines conceal a more worrisome global picture. The pandemic's profound political and socioeconomic effects that could halt or reverse advances in women's political inclusion. The pandemic hit at a time when feminist advocates around the world were preparing to celebrate the 25th anniversary of the 1995 Beijing Platform for Action and making a new push to realize its progressive commitments. Although the past 2.5 decades have brought significant progress in women's political participation, the overall pace of change has been slow and uneven. In many places, progress regarding gender equality in public life has stagnated in recent years, threatened by illiberal and authoritarian actors seeking to roll back past gains. Governments and assistance providers need to act swiftly to ensure that the pandemic does not spur a hardening of exclusionary political structures. Only political processes that are reflective of citizens' diverse experiences and accountable to the most marginalized social groups will produce pandemic responses that mitigate rather than deepen social and gender inequalities.
There are 4 emerging risks to women's electoral participation.
These risks include greater reliance on informal practices that reinforce male political dominance, increasing economic precarity, and a return to traditional gender roles, inequities in access to online platforms, and decreased public visibility of women.
There are opportunities to reinforce women's political leadership.
In order to address these risks and reinforce women's political participation during and after the pandemic, governments, civil society organizations, and aid providers cannot proceed with business as usual. Instead, they need to systematically revise their election guidance and assistance using a gender lens and renew their push for gender-inclusive institutional reforms. Much can and should also be learned from gender equality activists who are working to support female voters and candidates at the local level, whose efforts need ongoing domestic and international support. Invest in data collection. To systematically address emerging challenges, we need a better picture of how the pandemic is reshaping women's political participation. Citizen-led election observation groups are well placed to collect such data. Observation training materials and checklists should include targeted questions on women's ability to vote and run for office, including how increased financial precarity, caregiving responsibilities, and disruptions in formal political processes differently impact women and men, as well as relevant subgroups of women. Support female candidates. As noted above, many women politicians are well positioned to speak to the pandemic's impact on local communities. To leverage this opening, assistance must address the new barriers women candidates face in many countries. Traditional modalities of support, such as training workshops, need to be adapted to account for social distancing. For example, by combining remote support with smaller in-person meetings or working more extensively with grassroots groups. Now, more than ever, such efforts need to be initiated early enough to allow for local input and adaptation. Moreover, when appropriate, candidate training needs to include a stronger focus on building digital skills in order to help women candidates make greater use of online platforms and protect themselves from cyber abuse and harassment. Given the impact of the crisis on many women's financial power, new strategies also need to be instituted to recruit women to run for office and to provide financial and logistical support for those who do. Political parties can make dedicated funding available to female candidates, whether in the form of pooled campaign funds or earmarked party financing. Donors and local civil society actors can push for campaign finance rules and monitor their reinforcement. Those that work directly with political parties should also increase pressure on party leaders to abide by candidate selection rules, ensure gender balance on pandemic-related committees, and recruit qualified female candidates. Address women's security needs. Given the documented increase in gender-based violence during the pandemic and heightened risks of overall insecurity, additional measures are needed to ensure the security of female political leaders and advocates both offline and online. Such efforts should begin by analyzing dynamics within the home. We need to better understand, document, and address the implications of domestic violence on women's equal political participation as an electoral integrity issue. This may require observation efforts to reach out to hotlines or other data collection mechanisms for understanding violence in the private sphere. Social media platforms need to be pushed to better monitor and regulate online harassment against politically active women, including through government regulations that force companies to be more transparent about their content moderation practices, to invest in more culturally informed moderation, and to remove abusive content more swiftly. Push for gender-sensitive electoral reform. Electoral rules need to ensure that publicly funded media outlets give female and male candidates equal time and present female aspirants in a fair and unbiased manner. Invest in feminist networks. Once women are elected, external support should prioritize supporting stronger networks and dialogue between feminist actors in government and those mobilizing for gender equality within civil society. Having women in decision-making bodies alone is not sufficient to ensure gender-sensitive policies. Female and male politicians need to be informed by and accountable to gender and social justice movements. Such networks will be essential in ensuring the adoption and implementation of progressive policies that can help mitigate the intergenerational impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on gender equality. This research is the result of a collaboration with the National Democratic Institute, including its centers in Burkina Faso, Mexico, Poland, and Uganda.
While this information can be discouraging, as long as we act sooner rather than later, we can work toward continuing to plug the gap that is widening in these sectors that are feeding into science and technology policy. Well, I know my brain is full from this lunch hour. I look forward to seeing you for episode 6, Women Pioneers in STEM and Politics. Facts for lunch from a real lady.